Good morning, everybody. Right, what Liz and I are going to be talking about today is not specifically something about Vietnam, but about a British Council project. And we're looking at designing, as it says here, an international English language evaluation using a standardised test. What does that mean? Very simply, what that means is that we're trying to look at the feasibility of doing something similar to the PISA exercise in literacy and maths, but in English as a foreign language. I'd like to say, first of all, that I am not in any way an expert in large-scale evaluation. Fortunately, we have Liz, who is, and our colleague Claire from ASA, who has a lot of experience with PISA and TIMMS. So if you've got any sensible questions about large-scale evaluation, please ask Liz and Claire. But what I do know something about, I suppose, is that I have worked for many years with governments, with universities in countries which are undergoing change. And part of that change is a major reform of English language teaching. I've done that in China, in Eastern Europe, in Latin America, and in North Africa. And it was actually in North Africa where I was sitting in my office, and we'd been using APTIS to do some very large-scale testing. For example, trying to test a lot of teachers in the education system. Also testing cohorts of people, in fact, from the military who were going to study abroad. And I suddenly thought, wow, APTIS is actually, and I'm not here to sell APTIS, by the way, that's not my job. But I did think APTIS is a great tool for doing this kind of large-scale testing. And what about if the British Council did an exercise where we tried to do a PISA for English? So I was sitting there in my office in Tripoli having this thought, but fortunately there were some much better informed people in London having the same thought at the same time. So when I heard that this project was up and running, I immediately got very, very interested. That's my idea! And got very involved in it and had a lot of conversations with Liz and colleagues, and it's been absolutely fascinating. Bit of a roller coaster, but absolutely fascinating. Okay. So we all know about PISA, I think, an exercise where we test young people at the age of 15, essentially in maths and literacy. I hope everybody's familiar with it. Have I got a clicker somewhere for the presentation? Okay, that's me. Okay, right. I'm going to be talking a little bit about what's happening now, and Liz is going to talk about some of the challenges. How do I move it? Thank you. I just kind of wave and it will move on. Okay. All right, what I'm going to be doing is showing you some information about PISA, but what I'd like us to do is sort of reflect on that in the context of English and English language teaching internationally. So it was very interesting. Can we go back? Thank you. That one, thank you very much. Okay, great. Okay, I thought this was a really interesting thing I found about PISA. That OECD looked at all the information that was available about education systems, but felt there was a gap. And again, this is something that I've very much found. The British Council runs a lot of projects with countries, and countries run their own projects without the British Council, to improve English language teaching. And we always talk about the inputs. We talk about, oh, we've trained thousands of teachers. Oh, we sent people to the UK to study. We've done this, we've done that, we've worked on the curriculum. All the inputs, but the problem is it's very, very difficult for us to talk about the outputs. And for me, I think what's really important is that we can say that all the work that we've done is actually having an effect on the students in the classroom. If we can't say that, we're just talking about inputs. So how can we get to a point? It's actually, when you start thinking about it, very challenging. How do you say that this project, which may have gone on for 10, 15 years, has had an impact on students in the classroom? But if we can't say that, it's very difficult for us to measure the success of what we're doing. Also, I think something that's very much happening now, and wasn't happening when I started my career, a million years ago, is that countries, as with PISA, are looking beyond their borders. When I talk to ministries in lots of countries, What they want to know, what they're really interested in, is examples of good practice from other countries. What's going on in, you all know, I think many of us know, that in Eastern Europe we had some fantastic projects and really transformed English language teaching. It's very hard to get that data, but people are interested now in what's happening in other countries. We're looking beyond our own borders. Also, I think this concept now, and this is why I was sort of thinking about actors, what we have now, of course, is we do have an internationally agreed common framework against which we can measure language proficiency. We have the CEFR, which has made a huge difference. So if we have a test which tests against the CEFR, obviously the results in China, the results in Taiwan, Vietnam, Poland, Brazil, we can compare now because we have an international framework that we all accept. I hope everybody in this room accepts. We all understand what it means. So, the question is, for English, can we, indeed, should we, conduct an exercise which will do some of those things, which will evaluate the outcomes of what we're doing in terms of students' achievement, that will find evidence for successful policies. Not, I think it would be very foolish to say, oh, this country did very well, we did this exercise and the students scored B2, so obviously everybody should do what they're doing in this country. That's a very simple equation, and there are lots of complexities about what affects students' proficiency in English. But it gives us something, it gives us some information if we can do it. And finally, measure student achievement on a regular basis and against an internationally recognised framework. Can we, should we do it? Right, well, what happens when you do it? These are some of the reactions to the PISA exercise. England needs a rocket under them. PISA shock. Sputnik moment, Pearl Harbor Day, for heaven's sake. Massive wake up for American education. The press gets very excited about PISA results. I think the question for everybody in this room is, if we did this for English, would we be prepared to accept that the press might get very excited about the results that we can produce? It's a good thing, because maybe it does put a rocket under the education system. But obviously sometimes those kind of knee-jerk reactions, panic reactions to results are not always constructive and are not always helpful. So it's a risk. I was interested to find that despite needing a rocket under us in England, I have been searching and searching, again perhaps Claire can tell me more, but I've been searching and searching for the impacts of England's kind of okay PISA results on various government websites. And unfortunately, although we needed a rocket, I'm not quite sure that we launched that rocket. But in other countries, some examples here, reactions to PISA have been quite extensive. Harmonisation across countries where there have been very separate education systems for historical reasons, reform of the curriculum, reform of classroom practice. I think there's a lot of evidence that despite some of the headlines we see about PISA, essentially a lot of the responses have been very measured and very positive for education systems. Vietnam, of course, is famous for its excellent PISA results, given the level of economic development of the country. And I know in Vietnam there's a lot of discussion about why that is, whether that's a good thing. But I think what's interesting is that because of these PISA results in Vietnam, there are now a number of organisations, and very distinguished organisations like RISE, conducting large-scale research here to find out what's happening. So, no, we're not going to have a panic reaction. We're not going to have a knee-jerk reaction. We're not going to say everybody should copy Vietnam. But there's large-scale research taking place in Vietnam that I think probably wouldn't have taken place without those PISA results. Now, there are already some organisations that are providing data on national proficiency in English, and I think it's to the credit of all of these organisations that they're doing it. I think we all know about the EF or many of us may know about the EF Index, and there are other organisations as well that do this. As I said, I think it's excellent that EF is sharing their data. It gives us something, and without that we wouldn't have anything. But it has to be said that it's a very specific group of people whose test results are shown on that EF Index. And it doesn't really necessarily, and I think EF would agree with this, it doesn't actually reflect national proficiency of people in state schools across the country. The European Survey of Languages is very interesting, a very well-conducted survey of levels of second and third foreign languages in Europe. Unfortunately, they didn't test speaking proficiency. And I think everybody in this room will go, a test of English, a foreign language test that doesn't test speaking proficiency, excuse me. Perhaps that's a bit of a limitation, but it's a great exercise that was done. ETS and IELTS, obviously, very specific kind of audiences, specific kind of groups. It's all useful data, and as I say, much credit to these organisations for sharing what they have. But it's not quite the same as the PISA exercise, it's not quite the same as we've been talking about. So what we've been thinking about in the British Council is a model that might, if possible, do something like this. Looking, excuse me, the same age as the PISA exercise, around age 15. Test proficiency in all 4 skills. Produce an index where overall country scores can be shown and used as one measure of the success of the country's English language policy. And I would repeat, one measure. This is not the only measure of success. There are lots of other factors. What would be very interesting, and one of our frustrations again in the British Council, is that we try to do exercises where we try to correlate English proficiency against economic success. But it's very difficult because we don't have a measure of English proficiency. This would give us the ability, if we had that data, to start to correlate that information against things like economic success, where we do have measures. Innovation scales, for example. Is there a correlation between English proficiency and innovation? Don't know, maybe not. But at least it would give us the ability to look at that and see if there is anything else there. So it would give us the data that we could use to conduct further research exercises. And perhaps as well, although I say we have to be very cautious about this, it might offer us a means of identifying and learning from countries which have been successful. Which ones, where is it working? What can we learn? I think definitely, as we can see from the press reactions to PISA, it provides a focus for investment in English language education. And one of the things that I have always been keen to do, I think that one of the key ways of improving English language competence in a country is to increase the status of English teachers in that country. If we were evaluating and able to assess the success of English, there would be a lot more interest in what English teachers are doing in the classroom. And I certainly hope that it would lead to people valuing that work much more. So, those are some of the positive sides of what we can do. And I just wanted to finish what I was saying by referring to Shanghai's response to their extraordinary PISA results. And I think this was a really nice way of thinking about the benefits of this kind of exercise. So please, my Chinese colleagues in the audience, forgive my pronunciation. The first character there is Xin, and it means self-confidence. And clearly, Shanghai was given self-confidence, and I'm talking about us being confident about understanding the levels of English proficiency in different countries. But Shanghai was also very, very careful to say that what was also important was the second thing here, which was Zexing. And Zexing refers to self-reflection, consideration of our position with reference to other people in the world. So yes, we may get a good result, but it's very important to combine that with a reflection about ourselves in the context of what other people are doing. So if you'd like an English language idiom to kind of match this beautiful Chinese way of referring to these two contrasting ideas, I think it's something like not resting on our laurels. Yeah? That what we need to do is to look at the results, look at the proficiency of English, but also not do that in a way which is complacent, but in a way that leads to greater reflection and consideration of the implications of the results that we've got. So this is my sales pitch for this fantastic exercise, which I am a great believer in and I really, really hope we can do. Liz is going to talk about some of the challenges, because it has been a challenging process. If you start to think about the practical implications, which I'm sure you're all doing, saying, yeah, that's nice, but how do you do it? Liz is going to talk a little bit about how you do it. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you, Cherry. Good morning, everybody. My name is Elizabeth Sheppard, and it's such a pleasure to be here in Hanoi. I'm travelled here from the British Council, based in London. Before... Oh, gosh. I got that wrong. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you, sorry. Before I go on to talk about some of the challenges that Cherry has already referred to, I'd like to thank Cherry, not just for her excellent presentation, but for her ardent and dedicated and passionate and most crucially critical analysis of the undertaking of this exercise. Without Cherry, we would not be where we are today with this project. I'd like to thank you a great deal. But before I go on to talk about some of the methodological challenges to delivery, I would like to go back to Cherry's final slide, to the question of should we conduct this exercise. It's something that we talk about in the British Council a great deal, and something I think Cherry has articulated brilliantly in the first half of this presentation. Knowing what we know about the impact of international surveys, should we, just because we can, should we undertake this exercise? It is a discussion that we have in the British Council a lot. It is a discussion we hope to have with every member of this audience for the rest of today and ongoing into the future. And I don't think we will find an answer, maybe until we've had the opportunity to look at the data and to use the data and to work with all of the stakeholders that can, in our hope, benefit from access to data of this kind. So we hope to have that discussion. But moving on from should we, I would like to address can we? There are a number of existing English language proficiency data sources that Cherry has, we monitor and watch and try to understand how people use existing data sources so that we can plan and understand the outcomes from our data that we aim to collect via this project. But the question I would like to try to answer today in the next section of this presentation is, can we design and deliver, most crucially, research that meets, as our colleagues from ACR describe, that meet the gold standard in world-class international surveys. Not just meet the gold standard of international surveys, that we can provide and create and give access to a trusted, credible, valid and reliable source of data that will mitigate some of the potential risks that we know and that we've seen and that we are fully aware of. So, unsurprisingly, based on the considerable amount of research, the PIMS, as we often refer to it as, the PISA, the TIMMS, the Pearl surveys that exist in the world, there's a considerable body of academic research that tries to understand how, in international surveys, you create equivalence. Forgive the relative amount of text, but there are three crucial points that I would like to pick out of this paragraph. So, creating equivalence involves the mitigation of bias. Bias refers to the presence of nuanced factors in cross-cultural research, and 3 types of bias exist. These are referred to as construct, measurement, or item bias. Equivalence refers to the measurement of level characteristics that apply to cross-cultural score comparisons. And what we know and what we understand is that bias jeopardizes equivalence. And equivalence is what we're aiming for, so that we can, as Cherry said, compare like for like the English language capability of all of the countries, certainly that the British Council works in, potentially around the world. So, construct bias, method bias, and item bias. They are what we want to try to minimize in order to create the international comparison, the international survey of English language capability. So, we heard a lot about construct. I know that my close friend and colleague Jamie Dunley mentioned construct in his presentation yesterday. I know that Rhiannon from the University of Oxford, in her amazing study, which she's somewhere here in the audience, we're going to swap notes after this presentation and hopefully compare the process and eventually the outcomes from all of our work, also mentioned construct and went into quite a lot of detail about the construct that underpins the Young Lives research, which is just now moving into the assessment of English language. So, the construct. The construct for the English impact research, which is the name that we have given this project internally within the British Council. The construct that underpins this research is the definition of the population that will take part. Now, this may seem like 4 sentences, but there's been a considerable amount of work that's gone into refining, honing, and deciding on every single part. My colleagues who are involved, and there's a lot of colleagues in the room who've been very closely involved, not just Cherry, but a lot of colleagues who have assisted us a great deal with the design of this research. A huge amount of thought has gone in to the definition of this population, and it is also based upon the wealth of pre-existing knowledge and experience, and our particular definition takes greatly from the TIMMS population definition, the construct that underpins the TIMMS exercise. So, let's break this down. Students within the International Comparison Unit. I'll go through them all first and then revisit. Students within the International Comparison Unit. Remember those 3 important words. Enrolled in the grade that represents 10 years of schooling from the first year of ISGED Level 1. Providing the mean age at the time of testing is at least 15.5 years, who are currently studying a minimum of 90 minutes of formal English study per week as part of their studies at this grade level. Okay, quite a mouthful if you say it all at once, but we'll go sentence by sentence. Students within the International Comparison Unit. We all know of Shanghai's incredible performance in PISA and how controversial that has been. But what we understand from our colleagues who we're working very closely with in partnership to undertake this study is that increasingly it's recognised in international surveys, it's being recognised that national level data collection isn't not only very expensive and time consuming, but is also sometimes too much of a broad brush that doesn't allow us to look at the particular province or region or city where policy decisions are being made and where education it really comes from. So international comparison units, there is a trend toward a subnational unit of comparison. So we have had to work very, very closely with each of the countries involved in the design of this study, the Ministries of Education, who are also very closely involved, and understand exactly the unit of comparison we're talking about. And when we look at the next form of bias, method bias, it will become very, very clear why this comparison unit is so important to get right. It underpins the entire exercise and should be given great consideration. So, to our next sentence. Enrolled in the grade that represents 10 years of schooling, counting from the first year of ISGED level 1. Hands up if you know what ISGED is. I have a lady in the front, good. And there must be other colleagues in the room. ISGED refers to the International Standard Classification of Education and was developed for the purposes of exercise of this kind, so that we can look at education systems in East Asia, in South Asia, in Europe, in the Americas, and compare, in as much as possible, like for like, the attainment and the outcomes from levels of education that sometimes vary. So our population definition involves looking at the first year of ISGED level 1, which broadly refers to primary school level education, and counting 10 years up. So each of the students that takes part in this survey have had the same amount of school instruction, providing the mean age of at the time of testing was at least 15.5 years. Now this refers to ensuring that, because this is an age and grade-based population definition following the TIMMS model, that we have taken into account the retention and promotion policies of schools, which are very different in different countries. So our students kept back a year in school if they don't perform to the required standard, or indeed promoted early on. So it's important that we have at least the mean age of 15.5 years. And finally, and most crucially, every student that takes part in our research needs to be studying English. I think the ethics of conducting an exercise of this kind, we would never expect a student who hasn't learned English to sit down and take a full skills proficiency test. Unsurprisingly, how did we arrive at that figure of 90 minutes? There was great consultation and discussion with all of our colleagues who, around the British Council world and 5 regions in which we operate, are involved. You know, it is the core of our business to work in the classroom, the English language classroom, as Cherry said. We have extensive experience. So to some of you, this may seem quite a low number, a short amount of time, but in some countries, this is quite a significant undertaking during the week. So 90 minutes of study of formal English per week. Gosh, I've only got 30 minutes, but I'm going to skip through. So this is the construct, the population definition that underpins our research. So from construct bias to method bias. Now, method bias is often understood with reference to sampling. Sampling and the instruments used to carry out research and the processes and the administration of how the research is carried out. Essentially, as Cherry referred to, how are we going to do this? So, our research is the sampling methodology that we use is based on a 2-stage cluster sampling process. I hope this graphic explains brilliantly what a 2-stage cluster sampling process is, but I'll go into a little bit more details. The first stage, we select the schools. And then in the second stage, we select the students from within those schools. Now, following the international standards that are widely accepted across all international surveys, PISA, TIMMS, PEARLS, we will be working with a minimum of 150 randomly selected schools, as represented by the first cluster. 150 schools, you may think, some of you may think, gosh, that's not very many, or some of you may think, gosh, that's a lot. What's most crucial to remember and to understand when we go back to our construct and we think of our international comparison unit, when that is 150 schools all around China, you think, gosh, how are we going to deliver that exercise? But if that's 150 schools in Shanghai, then you begin to understand why the comparison unit choice is so crucial when it comes to the planning and the fieldwork and the operational delivery of an exercise of this kind. The basis of our study will be the random selection of 150 schools and then the random selection of at least 12 students that fit our population definition, so going back to the construct that underpins the research, that fit the population definition that we have already looked at. Why 150 schools, I hear you say? Why? What makes this valid? I think often there's a widely accepted misconception that sampling should be based on a rough proportion of any given population. And I've had this conversation 100 times with colleagues across the British Council who say, surely we should just sample around 10% of all 15-year-olds. That'll do it. And you think, well, yeah, I kind of get that, but the estimates and the outcomes for sampling of this kind are based on the precision of the undertaking of an exercise of this kind and meeting agreed international standards of exclusions, school level and student level exclusion. So what are those international standards? The first international standard that is very important to remember is that all students that meet the population definition within the comparison unit are eligible to be selected. So students can't just be discounted for various different reasons. If they're within the comparison unit, so if they're within the defined area where we will collect data, and they meet the population definition, they are eligible. The other international standard that we try to stress, and we're really beginning to get our heads around operationally, is at least 85% of the 150 schools selected must take part in the data collection exercise. So if we think of 150 schools, that's around 128 must take part in the exercise. And this is where, and Claire will go into this a lot more in her panel discussion at the end of today, well worth sticking around for. That's when we get into the territory of non-response bias, which has a huge effect on the precision outcomes of international surveys. So, the method that we have involved in our survey is as rigorous as we think we can make it. And why is this? This is in large part due to our very close partnership, friendship and strategic alliance with the Australian Council for Educational Research. I would like to attract everyone's attention to Claire Ozelins in the second row. She will be speaking. She's tried to remain anonymous in the programme without a photograph. Claire will be speaking in the final panel at the end of today. But from our experience of working with ACR, and Claire and I have literally left both of our teams to be here at the conference today, who are currently working on the in-school sampling processes, the writing of the methodology and the instructional handbooks for our invigilators as the project is just beginning as we speak. The partnership with ACR and all of their rich experience of working on international surveys such as PISA and TIMMS, etc., has really helped us to mitigate the method bias that could jeopardize our equivalence in our international survey. So, we also touched on briefly a moment ago, the instrument by which the test is delivered. Now, we're in a really, really fortunate position to be working with an incredibly innovative global exams team. And due to a number of excellent consultations and decisions with the colleagues who are working on this study, all of our tests, all of the tests delivered in all of the schools will be delivered via tablet. Now, that in itself, we believe, is industry-leading. No other survey, although PISA have said that it is the preferred mode in the 2015 study, although I think that probably means there's going to still be a fair bit of pen and paper testing involved. All of our tests, because we are testing reading, writing, speaking and listening, will be conducted via tablet. Now, this is exciting for a number of different reasons, not least that we have now the capability to deliver the test in an entirely offline setting. Most crucial, because if you think of the parts of Vietnam that we would potentially go to in the schools and the access to very, very high bandwidth internet may not be possible in all of the schools that we go to. And the technology and the resources that the schools have may also not be of a standardised quality for us to conduct the tests in all of the schools. So the delivery via tablet for us is a very exciting part of our methodology, and one that we hope will go some way to mitigating the method bias. I don't know whether, well, there may be some other colleagues in the audience who have a number of questions in their head when they think about, gosh, delivery of tablet in a school. My colleague Mark Walker, when we caught up at the beginning of this week, who has been very heavily involved in all of our exams work for an awful long time, said, gosh, but what about students who aren't proficient in the use of technology? You know, what if they've never seen a tablet before? Would that not have a potential negative risk? You know, we've talked about the mitigation of method bias. Will this not have a potentially massively negative effect on that student's performance and the stress that they feel and the experience they have? Well, we do understand this, and we have put in place a considerable familiarisation exercise that will be all under standardised invigilation. Every student will be guided through the same level of familiarisation with the tablet. We hope that that will give every student a fair chance of understanding the technology and using the technology. I said that there wasn't another international survey who was as forward-thinking and innovative as the British Council, but as you can see here from a leaflet taken directly from the IEA TIMMS website, in 2019, they aim to deliver TIMMS on a tablet. I don't know if you can read the joys of this giant screen. Two of the improving measurement, two of the bullet points at the top on the left-hand side. The TIMMS organisation believe that this delivery via tablet will be able to stimulate student motivation through its interactive and animated tasks. So they believe, and we've heard a little bit about washback during the conference, that there will be a positive washback on the experience that students have. So other innovation, and certainly the way international large-scale surveys of this kind are going. And last but not least, item bias. There is considerable, and I had the real fortune and benefit to go to the Language Testing Forum with colleagues from the assessment research team in the UK, and saw a number of presentations around the bias and the massive risks that exist via the inadequate translation of the PISA assessments, the PISA exams. One mitigation of item bias that we are fortunate enough to have is that we are testing English. All of the tests will be in English. The instructor invigilator manuals will be translated into local language so that the instructors and the invigilators can give as much clear guidance to all of the students that are taking part. But the assessment and the test, of course, is in English. There are obviously the consequences of using standardised tests, the positives and negatives. I'm sure all of the colleagues in the audience are familiar with. But certainly, we are lucky enough to be mitigating the item bias via the sole testing of the English language. And finally, to wrap up, where are we now? Most crucially, and this was why I was so interested in the development of the Young Lives research being conducted by the University of Oxford, is that we have found, and through Cherry's guidance, that Ministry of Education collaboration is absolutely crucial. If we think back to those international standards that we have to meet, 85% of all randomly selected schools have to take part for us to meet the precision standards for delivering this research. And we have to have the level of Ministry of Education collaboration in order to get access to schools and in order to deliver the research and make it a fair and ethical practice also. We're working very hard with every single one of the countries involved at this stage in the technical solution design and hardware testing. If you think about the keyboards need to be different, so that students in different countries are familiar with the keyboards. The headphones need to be of such a high standard that when they're doing the speaking test, the listening test, sorry, they can hear adequately, and the speaking test so that the microphone works enough so that we can capture the speaking data. My colleague Judith Fairburn, who is advising on this delivery of this solution and who will be presenting on speaking later this afternoon, has been helping us a great deal to understand how we capture that data and don't lose any of the valuable data that we aim to collect. The questionnaire, the background questionnaire for the students, obviously will need to be translated so we can capture the information about where they're from and how much English they do learn in the classroom. The sample frame collection, with which we are working very closely with Claire and her colleagues, the field operations training, the school liaison preparation, and most crucially, and I think this comes back full circle to Cherry's point, the theory of change and evaluation planning, so we can really begin to understand the outcomes from this exercise. And we hope the positive impact of collecting and sharing data of this kind. And of course, all of the data that we do collect will be open access and open to ministries of education, to academics, to learning communities, so that we can really begin to understand the benefit of data of this kind. And finally, I'd like to say thank you very much, and Cherry and I will take any questions that you have.
Thank you, Ellie. All right. Thank you, Elizabeth and Cherry. So we have time for only one question. So who will be the first? Okay. Do you have any question for Elizabeth? Yeah, please.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Cherry. I think it's a fantastic project. I think it's got very profound implications both at policy level, internationally, but also at classroom level as well. But I think you're right also to focus on bias. I think it does stand or fall on how well you grapple with that. And so I have a kind of a technical question around the bias and how to minimize that. Essentially, how do you minimize the bias around the selection of the schools and the pupils? Because I'm assuming that the gatekeepers for access will be education boards or even ministries, and ultimately teachers whose natural inclination perhaps will be to put forward their best schools, their best classes, their best students. How can you control that?
Thank you, Greg, and I know that this is a conversation that we've had on a number of occasions in the past. I guess how we aim to control for that type of bias is through collaboration with ministries of education, through clear communication of why meeting these standards is so important, so that it will make the outcomes and the data that we gather as realistic, as credible, as viable as possible, so that the exercise is actually useful, rather than just lip service to, hopefully saying that everybody in the country is a B2 standard and we've already met all of our targets. I think for this to be genuinely useful, I think we need to begin to stress and help people to understand why following those processes are really crucial. But yeah, it's certainly one we face, and we would report back on that and how hard I anticipate that will be in the future. Thanks, Greg.